You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 4, Arson, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 9. Blackcoats.
It is very easy to sneak up on a dragon. Their unobservant nature stems from the fact that nothing is foolish enough to approach them. This also means they are easily startled if they find something closer than any sensible creature should be. Do not, under any circumstances, startle your dragon.
Officially, there were 4 branches of the Royal Guard. The Peacekeepers were the most visible, patrolling and guarding places of importance in their blue uniform coats. They dealt with the petty squabbles and petty crime, preventing people from causing too much trouble or having too much fun by their mere presence. Then there were the red-coated Mounties, the soldiers of the Confederation. They all had large familiars they could ride into battle, polar bears and bison and such. As the blue coats kept the peace in the streets, the red coats kept the peace in the field. The theory being that the best way to keep peace there was to collect all the most dangerously violent wizards together and send them far away to fight monsters. The hounds were detectives. They, in their long green coats along with their canine familiars, pursued the perpetrators of the crimes the peacekeepers had failed to prevent. The last group were the most plentiful and the least thought of, the ledgers. They were the administrative wing of the Royal Guard. In dull gray uniforms, they did all the things that their more brightly colored colleagues wouldn't. They managed orphaned children, took care of the lost and found, did laboratory work, and generally managed the mountain of paperwork generated by the other departments. And then there was the 5th branch, the Shadow Branch, the Blackcoats. They did not actually wear black coats. They didn't wear uniforms at all. Because, as any member of the Royal Guard would tell you, they didn't exist. The Royal Guard were tasked with keeping the Confederation safe and peaceful, which was challenging enough in lands filled with wizards, strays, giants, luton, and werewolves. But the most troublesome bunch were the wizard nobility. Jarls, dukes, princesses, and marquesses were all constantly jockeying for power, employing wizards to invent strange and dangerous magics, building their own armies, or, in a very specific case, stomping around school grounds with armed knights in magical armor. People with that much ambition and power might get some funny ideas about what was and wasn't appropriate behavior. It wasn't uncommon for someone with enough money and magic to think that rules didn't apply to them, that the commoners were their playthings, or that their neighbor's land should belong to them, or that maybe they'd look good in a fancier crown and that might be worth starting a war about. And so, what the Blackcoats definitely didn't do, because they didn't exist, was keep an eye on the noblesse. They didn't infiltrate the ranks of their staff. They didn't eavesdrop or read correspondence. They certainly didn't collect favors and secrets. The Royal Guard did not have spies. Just ask any of them. "You aren't you?" sputtered Kuro, taking Arthur's denial as a confession. Maybe a few years ago he would have believed Arthur to just be blindly repeating things Dubois had said, but he was too old and too smart to disbelieve in the guard's worst-kept secret. "You're a blackcoat." "Don't be ridiculous," replied Arthur without expression. "The Blackcoats are just stories to scare children and earls. Besides, I'm only 16. The guard would never hire someone so young." Kuro ignored the defense. "Does your dad know?" Arthur grew some bushier eyebrows, the better to emote with, and scowled before casting a sidelong glance at the girls doing homework. It was as good as admitting it to Kuro, probably the closest thing he'd get. If he was reading the gesture correctly, Dubois knew, but Moira didn't. With attention drawn to the girls, he noticed that he couldn't hear their conversation anymore. Charlie and Moira were still chatting and smiling more than 2 people ought to while working on math. Azalea alternated between solving problems and glowering at the 2 distractions beside her. Yet their conversation sounded far away and indistinct, like it was bouncing through a maze of hallways before reaching his ears. "Are you doing that?" he asked Arthur. "Do you want to go for a walk?" replied his friend. Kuro nodded slowly while reassessing the shy, awkward boy he thought he knew. With an almost imperceptible gesture from Arthur, the sound in the room returned to normal. "We're going out," he said flatly. Charlie and Moira barely noticed. Azalea almost whimpered, desperate to escape her obligations, devastated to be left trapped with her work. The pair of boys said nothing to each other until well clear of Summerhill grounds and deep into the woods along a game trail. "Does Marie know you're spying on her?" accused Kuro. Arthur gave a judgmental snort and invoked some magic to muffle their conversation. The chirp of crickets and rustle of leaves that surrounded them in the summer woods suddenly sounded 100 yards away and around at least 2 corners. "Keep your voice down. I thought you were good at keeping secrets," he said. "But you're spying on your friend," argued Kuro. Arthur refused to respond to the accusation. Instead, he said, "After everything that happened last year, I decided I needed to step up. If I had been paying more attention, maybe none of it would have happened. And I was useless when things got tough. You rescued Marie while I sat in a tea shop." "That's not true," Kuro argued. "We wouldn't have escaped Niflheim without you. You tricked Phineas and then beat the tar out of him." "That was more Ms. Crawley than me," said Arthur. "She can really throw a punch, and I was shaking like a leaf after. I always wanted to be a hound like my dad, but that made me realize I'm not a fighter like the rest of my family. I'm not cut out to be a hound, and definitely not a knight. But I'm good at listening and not being noticed. I can be pretty sneaky when I need to be. I learned a lot from watching you." That was a bit of a backhanded compliment, but Kuro tried to take it in the spirit it was intended. "So if you're spying for Marie, why are you pretending like the Blackcoats don't exist? Shouldn't you be trying to figure out who in the palace is one?" "Marie knows exactly who and what I am." Arthur was being weirdly evasive, talking around the subject without ever denying or admitting anything. It was unlike him to be anything but completely forthright, and strange for him to use more than the fewest words possible. "But you won't tell me?" asked Kuro, uncertain whether he was more annoyed or confused. Arthur changed the subject. "You've been spending a lot of time in the kitchen this term, cooking even when there's no obvious reason to, and making food that sometimes none of the students eat." The bottom fell out of Kuro's stomach. He'd been caught. He could feel the tug of the promise made to Mere Pogo, preparing to punish him for not keeping the secret well enough and demanding he do something to cover his tracks. "I've been making extra for the Luton," he said. It wasn't a lie, not quite. It was for the Luton. He just left out the part where it was for them to give to a dragon. "Of course you are." Arthur accepted the evasion readily. "But if you were keeping some kind of secret from us, we know it would only be for a good reason, and so we wouldn't pry. You wouldn't do anything to put us in danger, even if it meant you breaking a promise. You'd die first." Arthur, through all of this, was very loudly and clearly not saying something. Despite being slow, clueless, and distracted by his own disgust at Arthur spying on Marie, Kuro finally caught on. It's not that Arthur wasn't telling something. Arthur couldn't tell it. He'd made a promise. A real promise. A fairy promise. Who, though, did Arthur know who could extract such a promise from him? Humans couldn't make them because of the horrible problem of actually having to mean what you said in your heart, not just in your words. Arthur was less human than Kuro. His shape was just a costume, and he wore it so well he could convince magic that he was a wizard. So he could make such a promise, but who could have and would have taught him how? "How is Ruby doing?" asked Kuro, changing subjects as Arthur had, with the aim of finding the outline of the secret Arthur was keeping. Ruby, or Lucy, or sometimes Nancy, was Arthur's birth mother and Marie's adoptive mother, a fact all of them had learned after breaking her out of Niflheim the year before. "Did you get a chance to spend any time with her? I don't think I ever asked." "She's doing well," said Arthur, making no outward sign that Kuro had stumbled onto anything meaningful. Still mostly living in the Blandlands as a human. And yeah, we got to have some good talks over the summer. She told me a lot of stuff about being a changeling, and she reconnected with my mom. We're all pretty happy that I can be a friend to Marie in the way she was to Princess Edain. And there, unless Kuro was very much mistaken, was the truth, or at least part of it. Ruby was a friend of Princess Edain before the coup d'etat. She was also her body double, secret keeper, and double agent for the fairy court. Arthur was publicly known to be two of those. It seemed he might have taken on all the roles of his progenitor. And, like her mother before her, Marie was aware of his divided loyalties. Possibly divided 3 ways if Kuro was right about the Blackcoats. Arthur appeared to be trying to not tell Kuro that he was working as a triple agent. The boy was walking a tightrope of intrigue to keep Marie safe from the many forces arrayed against the young and unprepared queen. Kuro felt a sense of regret in not trusting him implicitly, to have questioned him and his loyalties. Old distrust of the guard was hard to shake. He thought he should apologize and offer to help, but Arthur couldn't or wouldn't admit to doing anything that he needed help or accept that there was anything to apologize for. Instead, a question floated up, something Arthur had admitted to indirectly. "How do you know that I'm cooking? You don't live at the lodge anymore." "Oh, I'm there once or twice a week," replied Arthur. "What?" Kuro demanded. "When?" "Usually for dinners or in the evening. There are a few people who like to sneak out without anyone there knowing. I sneak in to replace them." Kuro looked at the boy he thought he knew with a combination of surprise and admiration. "And nobody notices?" Arthur shrugged, dismissing Kuro's shock. "Not yet." "But why?" "Lots of reasons," said Arthur. "It's good shape-shifting practice. I can keep an ear out for what's going on around campus. I get to check in on you and Charlie. I get to try the food at all the different residences. The clam curry you made last Tuesday was great, by the way. I wanted to let you know, but didn't want to blow my cover. There are even a few people who ask me to do it. It's useful to collect those kinds of favors." Kuro stiffened, though not because of anything Arthur had said. "We're being followed," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he needed to with Arthur's sound-baffling spell. "Are you sure?" "Yes, something keeps looking at us from the same height and direction." "Something, not someone," Arthur confirmed. "Yeah, too low to be a person and pretty far back. Their line of sight keeps getting blocked by trees." "Act casual," said Arthur. "Pretend we're still talking." Then he began to quietly cast a spell as they walked. Now that was insulting. Who was Arthur to be telling Kuro how to avoid raising suspicion? He'd been a spy for what, maybe 6 months? Kuro had a lifetime of experience in criminal enterprises. Without skipping a step, Kuro fell behind Arthur to block the view and walked single file along the narrow forest trail while he continued their conversation. He'd listened to endless versions of the same in his time in Detritus whenever people thought hounds were around, friendly chatter filled with nothing. He started by speculating about who was sneaking out and for what, which rolled neatly into gossip about new pairings and breakups, then onto talk of fashion trends. He pondered, as the vapid stories flowed freely from his mouth, that he found it much easier to talk about things he didn't care about than those he did, and wondered what that said about him. In the meantime, Arthur was conjuring a familiar. It took him several tries to get it right. It wasn't for lack of competence, but more that he kept stopping as the creature started to form. The familiars of human wizards were always the same. Nothing they could do short of a brain transplant could change the form their familiar took, although many tried anyway. It was part of who they were made manifest. As a changeling, the form of Arthur's familiar was as fluid as his own. The only familiar he could create reliably was a copy of Marie's raven. Practice hadn't made him able to pick a shape, but it had made him quick and quiet and able to see what was coming early in the process. He scrubbed several attempts before getting something adequately nocturnal and appropriate for the summer woods. As Kuro concluded a recounting of the new hairstyles in Autumn Lodge that year, a barred owl took shape and flew off into the woods in exactly the wrong direction. "Does it know where it's going?" asked Kuro. "Probably," said Arthur. They don't always do what I want. We're near the edge of autumn already. Want me to walk you the rest of the way home?" "Sure," said Kuro, working to avoid looking over his shoulder at whatever was tailing them. The thistles and ferns of summer gave way to the crunching leaves of autumn as they walked and waited for the return of Arthur's owl. It was only a few minutes before a scrambling in the leaves down the trail behind them let them know that something had happened. Moments later, the owl swooped silently into view and perched on Arthur's shoulder, ready for disassembly. It was unsummoned, bursting into strands of memory and seeping in through Arthur's senses. "A fox," he said, "a black one. I think it's a normal fox, though. Most familiars don't startle and run at the sight of a predator. Besides, no one on this island has a fox familiar." "You know everyone's familiar?" said Kuro, impressed. "On the whole island? Teachers and students?" "Of course," confirmed Arthur with no expression whatsoever. "Doesn't everybody?" Light through the lodge windows grew visible among the trees in the distance. Kuro had one more question to ask, the one that had kicked off the whole conversation. "How do you know Mr. Thrimpson takes off his headband at night?" Arthur smiled coyly, though it wasn't his smile he used. He shifted as he explained. "You sneak around in the shadows, pick locks, and climb in windows." The neatly parted blonde hair was replaced with tousled brown. His clean chin squared and grew stubble. "I can just walk in the front door." A perfect replica of Mr. Pendragon winked and started to walk away. "Good night, Kuro," he said. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.